Hi, my name is Kelly Paget, and I have the privilege to speak to you today about this synod on synodality that we had recently, and I had the privilege to be part of. My role is I work in the Diocese of Broken Bay. I'm the Chancellor and Head of Mission. But these last few years for me have been quite an extraordinary journey, as I've journeyed with many people in my own diocese and in the end around the world, as we've come to collaboratively discern what it is to be a synodal church, a church that is in communion, drawing people into participation and sending them forth on mission. As many of you may know, some time ago, our Australian church started this journey with the Australian Plenary Council. Like many of you, I was involved in the ground roots, part of the facilitation of and discernment at a level in our parish communities, but also for me in my diocesan role, drawing together the thoughts of people in this space. It was through that plenary council journey that I first came to participate in what is known a conversation in the spirit. It's a methodology that I've come to know and love really well, and something that's become quite instinctive for me now, after all these years. With the plenary council unfolding in its 2 sessions, I was then drawn into a specific role on the steering committee of the 2nd session of the plenary council. Through all this work, I've come to know many people and hear many people's stories. Now, during that plenary council time, you may be aware that Pope Francis then announced the next General Synod of Bishops. And he called it a synod on synodality, or a synod for a synodal church. For many people, it was a bit funny, to be honest, to have a synod on synods. But what Pope Francis was drawing us into is for us to think about what it is to be synodal as a church. He reflected on the fact that as a people of God, but also in secular world, we have really lost the ability to discern and discuss sometimes difficult topics without actually just arguing with each other. We tend to find ourselves finding a position and standing in it and then just yelling at each other from across a table. Pope Francis brought us into this time of the synod for us to think about how can we do this without yelling at each other. He really invited us to think about the fact that as a church, we're not called to be uniform, but we are called to be united. So as this was moving forward, Pope Francis was doing a number of things to get us to think about how we celebrate synods in a different way. We moved to round tables rather than the synod hall structure. But he also, in April of 2023, put out an announcement that for the first time ever, he would include non-bishop members to this Synod of Bishops. He invited thinking throughout our world, and our bishops in particular, who would be 10 people from every continental region that could represent your local churches, people who'd been part of the synodal journey and been witnesses to the benefits of it, people who'd been part of church life and had experienced many different things that could come to the table in the synod. But importantly, they were members of the synod just as the bishops, with full speaking rights and full voting rights. Now, at that time of that announcement, I was quite excited by this possibility. I certainly had no expectation or even thought that I would actually be one of those people that Pope Francis would call forward to be part of that synod. I remember very distinctly the day that I got a message from my bishop. It was the 2nd of July, where he was telling me that Pope Francis had selected my name to be part of the journey. And so a few short months later, I journeyed to Rome for a full month. It was very intense. It certainly wasn't a holiday. We worked 6 days a week, 8:30 in the morning to 7:30 at night. And we worked in round tables, moving through our working document, discerning and discussing at our tables, using conversation in the spirit as our methodology. One of the things I think I learnt from that experience, obviously I'd not been at a Synod of Bishops before, but in talking to other bishops who had, is the presence of non-bishop members enabled something that hadn't been necessarily present before. And that was a sense of vulnerability. Members of the Synod began sharing their stories and their truth in a way that actually enabled real growth and real honest, transparent conversations. Throughout the time, I had the pleasure of meeting people from all over the world. And at our tables, I was obviously at an English-speaking table. It would also be a large diversity of people from around the world in those conversations, and talking about some pretty tricky concepts at times. It wasn't all smooth sailing, but the methodology of conversation in the Spirit draws us into participating in a way that is really deeply respectful. What we were ensuring was not to have us all have the same opinion, but at least to have a consensus to say, I said this, and another person said this, and now we think we need to move forward having some greater conversations. My time at the Synod was quite extraordinary. So we had our first month gathered in October 2023, and then we came home and had some further local conversations and discernments before we went back again to Rome for the whole month of October in 2024. I had many opportunities to speak at that time and was often drawn to be my team's reporter. And so I would be speaking in the room and giving our group report. But in fact, it wasn't until the very last day of general interventions, I should say, at the Synod, that I had the opportunity to share my voice. I wanted to speak about the fact that so far in our conversations, we hadn't spoken much about how to assist our parish priests. I talked about the fact that our parish priests are often the ones who are dealing with significant life and pastoral issues, but are also being caught up in the governance of running a parish. And so sometimes they might be thinking more about paying electricity bills rather than helping the woman down the road whose husband might have left, or the family is in distress due to sickness. I then chose to be vulnerable and shared the story of my own family and my hopes for our church for those who live with disabilities and neurodiversity. I shared the story of my son, Denny, who has autism. I shared my hopes as a mother that we could be a church that could be more welcoming of those who live with disabilities and neurodiversity. And I shared the sadness that I felt that at times my own parish community that I've been actively involved in for more than 40 years sometimes hasn't been that place for Denny and our family. I invited us as a church to think about the fact that we have been really good at providing charity to those with additional needs, but perhaps we haven't been as good as inviting those people with disability and neurodiversity to be active leaders, that they themselves are baptised people of God who have the charisms and the gifts to lead, to be missionary disciples themselves. Now, in sharing that, there was a sense of relief that I had shared my story. But what it enabled at the small groups was a conversation about it. At all the small groups, people started to talk about this, and what resulted in the final document is paragraph 63. Now, paragraph 63 doesn't talk about my son Denny. It doesn't talk specifically about a mother who has a child with autism. But what it does talk about is how we as a church need to be welcoming and more inclusive of those people who live with disabilities and neurodiversity. It talks about the fact that we need to draw them into active participation. And in fact, it goes on to say that the church needs to start a research institute about how we assist those who live with disabilities and how we do incorporate them into the life and living of the church. Now, in our house, we now call paragraph 63 Denny's paragraph. But it's just a really good way of showing you when synodality works. When we come together and we hear people's stories. When we allow the Holy Spirit to come together and we can discern active decisions, we can come together with solutions to help the people. It was quite the extraordinary experience to be part of this synod. And of course, I did have the wonderful opportunity to meet with Pope Francis. In fact, I sat down with him a couple of times. I shared with him photos of my family, and he really genuinely asked questions about them, asked about my husband, Chris, and he took letters that my children had written for him. I had the opportunity to sit down with him a couple of times during that synod because he was just so open to us. I didn't quite expect that, in fact. I've seen pictures of people meeting the Pope that look so formal, but Pope Francis was with us in that room as a member, just like us. Every day when he came in the room, he would use the QR code on the back of his lanyard to sign himself in, just like everyone else would, showing that we had equal membership in this conversation. Certainly the last thing I'd like to share with you is the synod obviously was a particular event where you come together and you can discern some future direction. But I think what Pope Francis was teaching us, and what Pope Leo is showing us as well, that we actually need to be synodal as a church. We need to understand synodal spirituality, which is actually written about also in the final document. Some of my synod companions, or my synod siblings as we called each other, we talked about at our dinner table how we share this story back home. And we put it into 4 words. We said a synodal church is one that is relating, it is listening, it is discerning, and most importantly, under the example of Christ himself, it is self-emptying. If we can do all 4 of these things authentically and intentionally, that is how we're going to be a more synodal church in everything we do, not just in the gatherings that are synods. I would suggest to you, if you haven't read the final document, please do. It's a really good read, and it's the work of the people of God that were gathered there together. And as Pope Francis said at the end, it is now part of the general magisterium of the church. If you want to have some advice about how to understand synod spirituality, you can find online the meditations that Father Timothy Radcliffe, now Cardinal Timothy Radcliffe, gave us, where he broke open synod spirituality. At this time in our church, I think we really need to be focused on that synod formation and learning how to be more synodal in all that we do.